Welcome to RSP Scout Talk. I'm Matt Waldman, and joining me today is someone I've been looking forward to doing this show with for a while. We're going to have a running back episode, and someone that I've gotten a chance to follow in the recent months. And, Felix Sharp, who, obviously we see every other week here, really had great things to say about him, and that's Noah Hills. He has a site called nomoreparties.com. And it's the site, when you go right up there, says the best RB evals on the planet. Which, hey, look, I'm an RB guy. I know I'm known as one. Noah's known as one. What better than, all we need is Jay Moyer, and then we could have a trio here that would be a fun show of folks who really enjoy the running back position. So Noah, welcome. I'm so excited about being able to do this show with you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm very excited as well. Have followed your work for a couple years now. Got the most recent RSP, of course, and we had a good pre-show discussion. I'm looking forward to continuing that on air. Should be a lot of fun.
Without a doubt. So let's just start with this. I mean, if you want to learn more about Noah's site, go to Noah, Noah more MORE parties.com. nomoreparties.com, and you'll see that he's got free content. He's got content that that's paid content behind the subscriber wall, dynasty rankings, Debbie rankings, rookie rankings, rankings updates, all there. And I laugh because I look to see on his Twitter handle, you can also learn more about Noah there. Also Noah Hills, yours is at No More Parties, also on Twitter. Mm-hmm. And I looked at what was pinned there, and listen, it was meant to be because, being RB guys that we are, Noah started his site on February 6th, and February 6th is my birthday. So we're like, I'm just telling you, there's a connection right there. So why are you passionate about the running back position? Why'd you start it like this? Why'd you decide that you're going to devote something to running backs?
Yeah, I don't think when I first started writing fantasy content in 2017, my focus wasn't running back. I was just kind of a generalist, like I think most are. But I think I have always just been interested in and fascinated by running backs. I stopped playing football after 8th grade. But up until that point, I was a running back myself. So I naturally gravitated towards those players just as my favorite players in the NFL. Amon Green and Chris Johnson and Clinton Portis. These were just my favorite players to watch in the NFL. Reggie Bush was another one. So I just liked running backs growing up. And then when I first decided to make fantasy content, around that same time, I went on a backpacking trip with my dad and was prepping for a fantasy draft at the time. So I had just one of those fantasy magazines they put out every summer, and was flipping through one. And I just noticed that, Joe Mixon, Le'Veon Bell, David John, all these guys were roughly the same size, very similar athleticism. And so whether that was right or wrong, I think that was maybe a little misguided. I concluded that a lot of these good running backs in the league are kind of shaped similarly in aesthetic or physical ways. Like they have a lot of traits in common, something that is maybe kind of obvious, but I had never really noticed before, thought about. And then I got to thinking, is there some sort of, platonic ideal of a running back, and what would that look like? And so I started collecting data on running backs specifically. My process has changed significantly since then, but I think, that flipping through that magazine was what kind of sparked my my focus on running backs, and that's just kind of, I've followed that since.
Yeah, well, I love listening. I love hearing about some of the players that you were, that you liked as a fan, and then how you transitioned into this. So, I mean, tell us a little bit about, I guess to begin with, what are some things? I mean, I look at the running back position, and it's funny that you mentioned there's that your first thing that you noticed was a sweet spot in terms of dimensions, and I think that I would agree that you see a lot of that. But I also, it's interesting too to me that when you look at the position of what can work, at least as a contributor, I think, would you agree that it seems like there's a wider range of what could work in the NFL for that position than any other position in the league? Because you've got guys like Brandon Jacobs on one hand, way back when, who's about the size of a defensive end. But then you have some guys who, like, it's the extremes. I mean, but like Darren Sproles, who is smaller than a cornerback, might be a slot corner, But I mean, like, you're talking about like multiple position sizes where, like, defensive end tends to have a smaller, window, or linebacker, or any of the positions there. And it feels like with running back, at least from the extreme standpoint, there's a wide range of what can work, even if the ideal is tighter.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think wide receiver is similar, but I think you're correct that, like, you're not going to see a 260-pound wide receiver, where we have seen those kinds of running backs. So yeah, I do think, other than maybe kicker, but Sebastian Janikowski is really the only guy, and who cares? Who cares what they look like as long as they can swing their leg right? But yeah, I do think there's a wide range of body types and styles that can work at running back, and I do think noticing those kind of similarities between Mixon and Le'Veon Bell back in the day kind of kicked off my focus here. But I do think that that's something I've had to sort of correct in my own thinking, away from looking for the platonic ideal and more just thinking about what is a player capable of, what role does that make him suitable for in the NFL, what outcomes are available to him, versus, he doesn't fit into this criteria where a lot of the successful backs fit into. And so, kind of disregard. I've had to retrain myself after an initial orientation in one direction to acknowledge that, players don't have to look a certain way at this position. They can succeed in all different types of styles.
Yeah, that's for sure, and that's something I certainly had to learn too. I had to go through the same process, and it's like I kind of looked at it as players that offer, like, if they're not at that platonic ideal, what are the compensatory factors in their game, with their games, that still make them as, if not more appealing, or close to as appealing as the platonic ideal. And I think a guy that always reminds me of that, or symbolized that to me, was Dalvin Cook. Because Dalvin Cook, when you look at, maybe slightly on the lower side of the sweet spot, the vertical leap wasn't great. People weren't happy about some of the metrics with him coming out. He was not a hard cutting back, never has been really a dynamic cutter, though he does have dynamic movement. But his movement style was a good example of a guy who he played on the ground a lot. So that curvy linear movement, which I've talked a lot about, borrowed from Sean Miska, who's the movement specialist, who's worked with guys like Everson Griffin and Everson Griffith and a number of other NFL athletes. Patrick Mahomes is a good example of a player with curvy linear speed. When you watch him run, he bends around angles like a motorcycle going around a hairpin turn. And Dalvin Cook's that way. Even we watch him now, rarely do you see a lateral cut. You see him like pitter patter his feet to change direction. And so it's almost like saying, when you look at certain metrics, sometimes you look at the metric and go, that doesn't fit this player's game. Like, the player's style isn't about hard cutting. So if he's a bad hard cutter, but he can still make NFL caliber athletes miss and make certain angles or changes of direction, maybe that's part of the compensatory factor. There's a bigger risk, obviously, when you start looking at forecasting them, but that thing's still there. So I guess I'm curious, what are things like, I'd love for you to comment on that if you want to, or comment on, like, what are some things that you feel like people, in addition to that it can get done in a variety of ways, what are some things that people overlook about the running back position that you think is valuable based on where you're at with your process thus far?
Yeah, I think in relevant to fantasy football specifically, or fantasy football adjacent scouting specifically, I think a lot of that is numbers based, which is, kind of my natural inclination as well. But I think where that leads us to quite often is mistaking uh, measures or measurements of traits or of production or things like that as the arbiters of those things. And I think I kind of had a rant about this on Twitter the other day, but threshold based evaluation can mislead you because it acts as if a single measurement of a particular trait or ability or whatever it is the arbiter of that thing. And so somebody who doesn't run a 4.540 or a 4.55 or whatever it is slow. Whether he had training that was interrupted by injury, or whether he slipped during his 40, or whether he was sick, or whether he slimmed way down, or he bulked up to run, or maybe he's got good on-field speed that we can verify with tracking data. And I think the point is just that there are other ways to provide evidence of things outside the context of what we've tested and know works. There are other ways kind of to get at what's being measured by those processes that I think is easy to ignore because it's harder. Film study, I think, is one of those ways. There are other statistical measures. But yeah, I'm particular aspects of running back play are not really coming to mind, except for, I think, again, in the fantasy football adjacent evaluation space, I think we often evaluate running backs on everything but their ability to actually run the ball. We talk about how fast somebody is. We talk about how many passes he caught. We talk about how many yards he ran for and what his draft capital is likely to be. But all of those things sort of dance around and approximate how good we think a guy is at running the ball, but none of them actually directly reference it or address it, which is bizarre to me because running backs they run the ball. So we should probably care about who the best players at running the ball are, and we often don't.
Yeah, I think that's fast. It's funny how that is. And when you brought up, I love how you explained that idea about having thresholds, because again that fits also in with, say, Arian Foster being what, a 4.65. I think I'm 4.72 I think was his 40.
It was 4.7 something.
Yeah, it might have been worse than 4.72. I think you're right. So that he was in the 4.7 range. But you look at the quickness, you look at the cutting ability, and then most importantly, like you talked about, how does he set up blocks? How does he read leverage? How does he run the football? All the details that go into running the football. So with that in mind, I mean, what are things that tell us a little bit about your process and what people will find at your site in terms of the analysis that you're doing on the position?
Yeah, a lot of my analysis is focused on collecting data, putting players' performance in particular areas in historical context, whether that's, just yards per reception, or whether that's, the 40-yard dash, whatever happens to be, understanding how impressive a player is historically within the context of his own draft class, things like that. But I think as as my process has kind of progressed, I realized that I've essentially been attempting to do film study or film charting without actually having to do that. So all of these, I value on-field metrics quite a bit. So Pro Football Focus, I think, does some things well, some things not as well, but I think they have a noble aim to quantify player performance on the field in various ways. I think my process is similarly aligned, where now I'm charting film and have defined criteria for a neutral, positive, or negative grade in various decision making categories for running backs, like at the line of scrimmage. As well as I'm charting, physical interactions with defenders. This particular part of my process is heavily influenced by what you do in the RSP. You know, noting how players react to and succeed or not against various types of contact from various directions, and various degrees of solidity, I guess is the word I would use.
Sure.
From different positions, charting evasive maneuvers and categorizing them and noting whether they were successful or not. So what really interests me, I think, is what drives my process. I'm not really interested in maximizing an R-squared value for, fantasy points per game in a player's first 3 seasons. I think that's fine. But I think there's a lot of confounding factors that can throw off. Like, if you're evaluating players with the aim of accurately predicting their fantasy output in the NFL, you'd be better off evaluating NFL situations, probably, because running back in particular, I'm not a running backs don't matter guy, but I think we can all acknowledge that running back production and efficiency is very dependent on contextual factors that are just outside of their control. And so if your evaluation process is just trained on fantasy points per game, you're only evaluating half of what you need to. But I'm much more interested in just kind of understanding players, appreciating them aesthetically, and that means getting as specific as I can with what I'm measuring on the field. And some of the non-film charting metrics I like to use are things I've developed with the aid of access to box count data for both college and NFL players. So I want to know how efficient a running back is, but those kind of confounding environmental factors make that difficult to compare. What does Jahmyr Gibbs averaging, 6.2 yards per carry at Alabama mean versus Chris Rodriguez averaging 5.2 at Kentucky? Does that mean Gibbs is way better? Does that mean Alabama has a better offensive line? Is it both? It's difficult to say. So I have started using a lot of team relative efficiency metrics, where I am then able to, just contextualize Chris Rodriguez's per carry output relative to what the other backs operating in the same offensive environment are producing on their carries, to generate sort of like a baseline for whether what Rodriguez is doing is good, bad, somewhere in the middle. I'm also able to take into account the amount of defenders in the box that all of those guys see on a per carry basis, which is a large determining factor in the outcome of any running play. Naturally, more defenders closer to the line of scrimmage is more difficult to run against. So, kind of looking at per carry averages, per carry success rates, given those situational factors, comparing players to their teammates to kind of get a better idea of how they're coming to their efficiency, their stylistic ways of playing the game can kind of be gleaned from those metrics, and then marrying the insights gained there with now my film charting process has given me, I think I'm just able to speak more intelligently and more informed about players, rather than, well, it seems like he's good at this based on what the numbers tell me. But like, now I'm able to actually, go to the film and either confirm, deny, or confuse myself with more stimulus. So
Well,
I think that's kind of how I would describe my process.
well, let's do some of that with some of the players, and one that I think that I've been looking forward to hear you talk about, because he other than you and I think there's other people I know, but the two of the more vocal people on Twitter I know about Zach Evans have been the two of us in this room. So tell me why you like Evans's game and what stands out through your process.
Yeah, I think first things first, he ignoring the film, just looking at the numbers, what they tell me. I know he's had some injury history. There are some vague character concerns that I can't really speak to one way or the other. He transferred. He never really had a full workload. There are all these kind of vague concerns that sort of, people use to suggest that something must be wrong with Zach Evans because look at all these things, but none of them actually point to anything specific. And I think if you actually look at what happened on the field, he was incredible. All 3 years of college, really,
Yep.
we want our running backs to gain yards and get us closer to the end zone. And very few people, if any, in this running back class were better at doing that than Zach Evans, given the amount of touches he handled in college. He's incredibly explosive on a chunk gain generating point of view. He is one of the more consistent runners on a down-to-down basis in this class, producing positive outcomes very reliably, despite these, kind of vision or whatever concerns people have on film. It's not hurting him as far as output on the field goes, if those issues do exist. And he's one of the most efficient backs on a per. He averaged, 7 yards per carry, I think, at TCU. He's just been a beast on the field. Even as a receiver, he's got some concentration drops issues. I'm interested in your thoughts, maybe on his technique as a securer of the football in the passing game. But when he catches the ball, he's excellent out in space. I just think the numbers point to him objectively being an effective player when he plays. And my look into his film did nothing but kind of back that up. And so I think he's, despite the ancillary vague concerns that people have, I think he's just one of the most effective players in the class when he has the ball in his hands. And I think that's what we're looking for when we're scouting running backs.
Yeah. And it's funny because none of the off-field issues, none of the off-field concerns deal with crime or drugs or anything, any bad behavior, really. It was the biggest thing I heard was run-ins with coaches. Well, he got suspended for his championship game in high school because he wouldn't give his phone over the night before, which was a part of policy. Now, I may be adding more into this than was actually the case. It may have just been an immature decision without focusing on the drivers that I'm going to speculate. But let's look at the fact that, his parents, from what I hear, from what I read, weren't really maybe the central part of his childhood as much as his grandfather was. His grandfather was the paternal figure, and the grandfather passed away the year before he got recruited. He was a 5-star recruit, so everyone on earth was probably calling him. He was handling it himself, which, I don't know many 17, 18-year-olds who would probably handle that all that well. He was probably, he hadn't made great, he was indecisive about where he wanted to go, so probably having the phone on him was probably very important to him as he was trying to communicate these things. So he probably just didn't handle it right the way that he needed to. And so that made sense. The high school staff said he was a good kid. Now, they could have just said that, because you hear people say that, it's like when I think about FSU or LSU back in the day when they had a lot of guys get in trouble. And, they're good kids, and then, we find out a lot more, and it's more about their recruiting efforts that they were more worried about. But high school doesn't tend to be that way, I would think. So, on top of it, too, he was a great student. At TCU, he had a 3.75 GPA. He was academic. He was all academic as a freshman. When he left TCU, Gary Patterson was telling people around this time last year that he was expecting 30 players to leave TCU because the school hadn't gotten their NIL deals together right. So, no one thought TCU was going to become a championship team this time last year based on that. So when I look at all that, and it's not like and I've said this before, it's not like he went to Toledo or to Colorado School of the Mines after he left TCU. He went to Ole Miss. That's a lateral move, on the surface, if not a move up to the SEC.
Yeah.
And Yeah, and then Quinshon Judkins turned out to be one of the two best freshmen, at least statistically, in the NCAA or in Division One, and it seemed like they used him as Mister Inside and used Evans a little bit more as Mister Outside, where Evans at TCU was an all-around back. I mean, he was used in every capacity. So when I look at that kind of stuff, it seems to me a lot more smoke than fire. Um, and as a player, when I watched him as a receiver, I mean, I thought he was flexible. He scooped low targets out pretty well. I thought he did a good job of catching the ball away from his frame, which is important. I thought he used the correct position to attack the ball. Sometimes he attacked, but every receiver clap attacks targets. It's just how consistently and how egregiously they do it is what really matters more than anything. And he has some lapses where he has concentration drops where, like Terrell Owens or Brandon Marshall back in the day, where they had 57 or 60% catch rates and not very high catch rates, but they got fed the ball a lot. That most of their drops had to do with they were trying to get to open grass before they looked the ball all the way in. Teams can live with that. So for me, when I hear he's a horrible receiver, I kind of keep my mouth shut on that one and just hope that subscribers will read the scouting report and they can exploit that. Even with folks I respect who may see that and go, he's got horrible hands, and I look and I go, no, they're not so bad. That's all right with me. So yeah, I'm with you. And from what I charted, he was in the upper echelon in a lot of categories for contact balance or for pulling through reaches and wraps. And I liked your theory about this, and I believe I either quoted you or mentioned it, was his combine, he was what, 202 or 200, somewhere around there, but he doesn't look that way. So what was your theory about why he was that weight?
Yeah, he was listed at, I believe he was listed at 195 his freshman year at TCU, which I think is what he was listed at by the recruiting services coming out of high school. But as of his sophomore year at TCU, he was 212 on the roster, at least. Whether that's accurate or not, we don't know, but that's what he was listed at. And then he was listed at 215 at Ole Miss. So that's two different programs that had him listed at least 212 pounds. Sometimes you see schools, juice these listed weights on the rosters. I think it becomes a little bit more difficult to believe that it happened in a particular player's case when he played at two different schools, and supposedly that was happening at two different schools. I also looked back, and Kendre Miller didn't come in significantly lighter than he was listed at school, so TCU was presumably not juicing his number. I remember Snoop Connor or Jerry and Ely. These guys didn't have massive disparities in what they were listed at in school versus at the combine. Like I just don't think this theory about Ole Miss and TCU were boosting his numbers to make him look better on the roster holds a lot of weight. I think it's more likely that he actually, weighed in at 215. Maybe they juiced it up by, 3. Maybe they rounded up. Maybe he was 211. They're like, we'll throw 215 on there and make it look good. I think he probably played somewhere around 210-ish. And then it's not uncommon at all for players to drop weight to run faster at the combine. And he got hurt like a week before the combine, or at least around when the news dropped that he had a hamstring issue. And then he showed up to the combine at 202. This is like a 21, 22-year-old kid with whatever metabolism he wants to have. I remember when I was 21, 22, not training like an elite athlete, and I could drop 5 pounds or gain 10 pounds in a matter of a couple days if I wanted to.
Pretty much.
So he probably was dropping weight, maybe significant weight to run at the combine, ended up not being able to. He's not going to, interrupt his training and his dietary schedule with a week, for the sake of a week. So then he continues training after the combine. His agent reached out to me on Twitter and said that he weighed 208 pounds at his pro day. where he ran somewhere between 4.45 and 4.52. So I don't think we should have any concerns about his speed, uh, about his weight. I think, based on how he played on the field, you mentioned his contact balance and his power. I think he's uh, right. I've been charting these, kind of collisions with defenders and things like that. He grades out second among guys in this class that I've watched so far, overall, and kind of powering through contact, to only Zach Charbonnet, who is a well-established 215 to 220 pound runner. And the other guys in that area are Kendre Miller, Tyon Evans, Dwayne McBride. These are all 215 to 225 pound backs. Evans grades out highest for me in that area against linebackers specifically. If we're concerned about his size, it should be either because NFL teams will think he's too small, which
They'll figure it out.
NFL, yeah, we don't know what happens there. And if that's not the reason why we care, it's because we think it has some sort of negative impact on the field for him. And I think it clearly doesn't. He clearly does not run like a 202 pound running back would typically run. He runs like he's 220, regardless of what he actually weighs.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I find it fascinating, and I thought he was a more advanced decision maker than Bijan Robinson heading into this year. I think Robinson did a better job with decision making in certain facets of blocking schemes that he wasn't as good at the year prior. So you saw some growth with his game. But Evans, to me, is a very polished decision maker, very efficient runner in terms of maybe not, I don't know about the metrics, but in terms of like making decisions against penetration, understanding where what was the most efficient decision to make based on the blocking scheme and the keys that he's reading. He was really strong at all of that. And so to me, I would not be shocked as long as the character based stuff and the injuries are not an issue, and I think they're going to be a non-issue. I would not be shocked at all if he's one of the three best running backs in this class. And if someone said he turned out to be the best, wouldn't be shocked at that either, even with all the hype there is for Bijan Robinson.
Yeah, I'm completely with you there, and I want to circle back to the character concerns thing just shortly. As far as I can tell, the only thing we've got is these high school run-ins with coaches, the cell phone thing. In college, you mentioned that his good grades. As far as I can tell, there have been no other instances where he's had run-ins with teammates or coaches or media members or the law, or he's not hitting women. Like he doesn't have these significant issues. As far as I can tell, people didn't like how he handled himself during his recruitment, as if they're entitled to him making a hasty decision. And they assumed he's a bad kid because he didn't want to give up his his cell phone to his high school coach. Maybe those things matter, maybe they don't, but I think really what's happened is they've resulted in him just not being given charitable readings of his decision making ever since. And so every time he misses a game or transfers, he doesn't have the heart, he doesn't play through injuries, he lost his job to Kendre Miller and bounced, and then he lost his job to everything he does now is just being viewed through negative lenses because he's gained what I view as an unfair reputation as a bad kid or character concerns, whatever. But really all we've got is the cell phone thing, and then
yeah, and it's idiotic compared to the way people are making it out. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I don't know, I'm not a doctor. I haven't evaluated him from a health standpoint, but I am curious to see whether these injuries that kind of pop up for him and cause him to miss games here and there. I've seen it doesn't seem to be a particular, it's not like he has one knee that he keeps injuring over and over. It doesn't seem to be one particular problem area. And so I'm curious, is he just prone to injury? I think injury proneness is thrown out a lot, but some people probably are more than others. Is he one of those guys? Or I've also seen reports that I could never find actual sources for that say that Evans has been intentional and or vocal about wanting to kind of preserve his body and save himself for, an NFL workload throughout college. Whether that's a good strategy as a college running back or not is a different question, but I don't know the truth to that. I don't know if you've heard anything, but I think there are, these concerns that people have about him off of the field, I think can in some cases be easily explained, and in other cases are just silly.
Yeah.
And in other cases, it's, we just don't have enough information to make an actual determination. So we shouldn't act as if they're negatives on his profile when they very well might not be.
Yeah. The positive for fantasy GMs is that you're going to get him at a price or an investment price where it's going to be worth taking the chance on him. Because it's likely that the NFL is also, some teams are very good at sussing out character issues. Some teams suck at it. I mean, like I've shared this story a lot, but it's the idea of, and I've heard this discussed. It's the idea of going to, finding out that the kid parties a lot. And so one scout for a team will just take that to the bank from the recruiting coordinator and say that he parties a lot, and they just remove him from the board, or they downgrade him because the team doesn't have law enforcement experts or industrial psychologists who know how to ask the right questions, how to investigate something, how to take the information that's there and edit and actually make an assessment of it. Sometimes they have these scouts to make assessments, and scouts aren't experts in that for the most part. Some of them become that way, but there's not a real training program for that. So some of them will do that. Some will at least go to the bar and they'll ask a wait staff, "Hey, I have a picture of this kid. Does he come in here?" "Yeah, every Tuesday, Thursday, every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday night." "Okay, thanks a lot," and then they leave. Say he's there all the time. And then another one would go, "Well, yeah, okay, so he's here Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday night. Who does he come with?" "Oh, same people every time." "Does he drink?" "Nope, he brings a bottle of water." "Oh, really?"
Right.
"Yeah." "How long is he here?" 45 minutes to an hour and a half. Just talks to people. Other students come by and say hello to him. He's with the same guys. Never gets in trouble. Good tipper. Even though he even though he just drinks bottles of water, and he leaves.
Mm-hmm.
We never even. I mean, we just know him because he's always here, But it's for a short period of time. Well, that's way different. That's so different than what you have, and so I have to think that a good NFL team. But that's the problem. Is there maybe a good NFL team that knows he's a non-issue, but they're like, we don't need a running back. So,
Right.
If he falls to us in the 6th round, great. There may be another team that really needs a running back that isn't so good at it and goes, well, we'd take him in the 3rd round if we knew that his character wasn't an issue. But man, we think his character's an issue and it's not for the right reasons. And they're like, we're taking him off our board. So that's the craziness about draft capital and the assessments with it that can occur. I mean, Russ Landy, who's usually on our Scout Talk show, talks about Jimmy Smith all the time, the Ravens cornerback, because there was teams that took him off the board because they said he was a bad dude, like got in a lot of trouble. He smoked pot. That was the only thing he did, was that he smoked pot. And now it's legal in a lot of places, and it's become a much more decriminalized situation. And he's a bright, engaging, like mature guy who's never been in trouble. And the Ravens were like, yeah, he smokes pot. Okay, so that's what he got in trouble for. We're not going to make a big deal out of it. And there are a lot of teams that lost out on a pretty good player. So with that in mind, I mean, we have other players that we could talk about. I mean, we could talk about Evans all day, but if you want to wrap up Evans, fine. But I'd love for you to talk about Devon Achane because, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly because I don't listen to the broadcast very much. But if you, but I'd love for you to talk about him because I know he ranks pretty highly on your board, and I'd love also for us to talk. Maybe if we can also talk about Tyjae Spears and maybe a little tie on Evans because I'm a fan, and so I'd like I haven't. You're the only other person I've seen talk about Tyjae Evans as well.
Yeah. Let's go with Achane. I am not 100% positive how to pronounce his name. What I've seen most is Devon, so that's what I've gone with. Okay. Devon Achane. But I think, Evans, I think has, kind of the talent to be the RB1 in this class, looking back after 5 years. I don't think that's likely. I think it's probably, Bijan. But
sure.
Evans is a guy who has the ability to do it. I think Gibbs is a guy who has the ability to do it. Achane is also a guy who I believe has the ability to do it. I think pound for pound, he's the best talent in this running back class, in my opinion. You don't get, running back play is not graded on a curve on the field, so he doesn't get credit for being the best pound for pound. But I think it's, that's just how I would express how good I think he is. If he was 210 pounds, I think he would be the best player in this running back class because he's incredibly explosive, incredibly fast. His efficiency numbers that I like to look at are just off the charts, and they're not shaped the way that you would expect for a 188-pound running back who has near Olympic speed. You would expect that guy to look like, super high efficiency, maybe low per carry, consistency, like boom bust output on a per carry basis as they try to, bounce everything to the outside, or it's either a 50-yard touchdown or nothing. Achane did not produce like that on a per carry basis really at all.
He's no Tevin Coleman, huh?
No, he's not Tevin Coleman. There were times on film where I thought, I wish he would have bounced this one outside because I think there was a little bit more space, but he's just focused on getting north-south. He's got impressive, he's got bouncy feet and bouncy hips that allow him to make these kind of lateral cuts while still maintaining a north-south path, kind of slaloming through defenders and blocks on his way to the open field. And I think he runs with he's got below average play strength, I think, just because he's so small. But there are a lot of guys with below average play strength who are like 215 pounds, 210 pounds. I think Chase Brown is that way. Jahmyr Gibbs is that way, who's, 13, 12, 10 pounds heavier than Achane. Izzy Abanikanda, I believe, is that way to a certain extent. So I don't think Achane's play strength is deficient relative to a lot of other normal sized running backs. It'll never be a strength for him. But I don't think it's terrible. And I think he's a functional pass catcher who can make things happen out in space. He can do all the things as a receiver that Zach Charbonnet can. And people view Zach Charbonnet as a 3-down back. Achane can do the same things. He's just way more athletic in the open field. And I don't think there's anybody who can stay with him on like a wheel route up the sideline out of the backfield. I'm not sure that there's a linebacker or a nickel corner or a safety in the league who can stay with him. And he's just one of the best decision makers and cerebral runners that I've watched in this class. He's a good gap runner. He's a good inside zone runner. I think he's probably pretty well suited to an outside zone scheme in the NFL where you can get him on the edge. He can just plant and go. But I think he's got a lot of scheme versatility. I think he can play on all 3 downs. The question for me is just I've kind of excused myself from evaluating pass blocking this offseason because I just have no frame of reference. I have no base of knowledge from which to do that. So I don't know how good he is at pass blocking. That could be an obstacle for him getting on the field on as many third downs as we'd like to see. And there's the element of can he hold up to a workload in the NFL? Do coaches think he can hold up under a workload in the NFL? what kind of role do NFL personnel, people in NFL, coaching coaching staffs have for him in the NFL. But as far as, who are the best players on the field in this class, in the same way that I, kind of acknowledge that Evans has these other question marks, but is a really good player on the field, I feel the same way about Achane. He's and with both of these guys, Evans and Achane both, I did my evaluation, have kind of done my analysis, and then move on to other players. And then I see on Twitter or in other people's analysis, nitpicking or, people finding legitimate, flaws in their games or concerns. And I go back because, those things naturally seep into your thought process. So I go back to trying to refresh myself or, check my initial process. And every time I go back to Evans and Achane, I just, my initial impression just gets strengthened. It's like, no, the things that I saw on film are still the things that I see on film, despite, the things I'm hearing from other people. But yeah, I know you're lower on Achane than I am. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts, but I just thought he was really one of the best players in the class, size considered or not.
Sure. And listen, I mean, I have him as a rotational starter. Anytime you are above an 80, you have a chance to be a starter in the league. I think you have a chance to develop into that kind of a player. And I have him listed in that range. Now, the size thing for me was a little bit more of a deal, but at the same time, he had some pretty good marks with breaking through reaches, bouncing off hits, and he was able to do it against some larger defenders. I think that for him, the pass protection, like you talked about, what I would say is he actually showed some improvement from 2021 to 2022. He showed some ability to identify certain types of blitzes that he's going to see a lot in the NFL, like cross blitzes. He times his cut blocks better than what he did. He's timing them well and getting good height on them. He's actually kind of using what I call a standing cut block across the frame of defenders, which rather than trying to leave his feet. But it's working. He can use his hands well. They can be a little bit tighter, but they're things that can be refined. Are you going to expect him to take on defensive ends or strong side linebackers in the NFL? I doubt it. Not unless he's able to add additional weight to his frame, and maybe he can add another 10 pounds to his frame and be, I don't know, but at 5'8", again, Maurice Jones-Drew was over 250 at one point, and he was 5'6" or 5'7", 5'8", somewhere around that range. So if Devon Achane can be 208, I thought LaMichael James was around that range. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, LaMichael James wasn't all that good. I think LaMichael James was a little bit before his time. So I kind of see him as a LaMichael James type of player who, if you have a lot of work from pistol, shotgun, spread the field, like you said, wide zone, some gap plays, he's the type of player that could work out well in that respect. I mean, I just think that, if he just improves his blocking, and then maybe, in terms of decision making, I thought he had a good feel for cutbacks. I thought he was disciplined about following and setting up blocks and gap. He was good with lead blockers. I didn't see anything where anything stood out that was an issue with his decision making at all. So for me, it's just about can he break tackles, push a pile, bounce off contact, and get better as a pass protector. If he proves that he can do both, show more power and contact balance on a consistent basis and improve his pass protection a little bit more, you're looking at a guy who's a borderline starter in my grades. It's not that far away. So,
yeah,
to me, I was looking at I have him 11th on my board, but I've told pretty much my readers that, or 12, I think he's 11th or 12th, but my top 12 guys are the guys that I think could be starters in this league. He's just at the bottom of those two tiers that I think consist that. But I'm not worried. To me, we're talking. That's why I like tiers more than rankings, because it's like,
Hmm.
what can you improve? If you're, I look at it this way. If I were to tell you back A has a score that I have as an immediate starter, but there's not much more he can improve upon. Um, but back B has two things that he can improve upon, and it would vault his grade like 6 points if he could do it, and it would make him higher than back A. And those things are reasonable to expect some level of improvement, even if he didn't get all the way there. You'd still, I mean, you'd value that guy. So, like Achane to me, when people see LaMichael James, because that's where I have him closest to, they go, that's not very good. But I like LaMichael James coming out of school. I thought that there were certain skills with him that work well. And if Warwick Dunn is at the top of the board, as a guy that I comped him to stylistically and dimensionally, in terms of physical dimensions, Warwick Dunn LaMichael James is not bad for a 5'8", 188-pound back who might be 208 when it's all over with. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I've seen Javid Best as another point of comparison.
Yeah.
I don't hate that. Raheem Mostert's not a terrible one. And I do think that the sort of range of outcomes or developmental potential or area, those things are difficult to capture in rankings, or difficult to kind of calibrate, where in relation to each other players should go. So yeah, rankings are tough in that regard. And I also think, back to the weight thing, one kind of theory I have, or hypothesis I have, I guess, is that Achane has been running on the A&M track team for the last 3 years. He is a near world class level sprinter.
Yeah.
He's presumably now not going to be doing that, near to the level that he's been doing for the last 3 years. If he was kind of splitting the difference between the ideal body type he'd like to have for sprinting versus the ideal body type he'd like to have for running the football, if he was kind of not hitting either ideal and instead splitting the difference, and now he's just playing football, I don't see why he wouldn't bulk up. He was already heavier at the combine than he was listed on the A&M roster, just by a little bit, but we saw him add weight, still run really fast. And then even if he still wants to run track, we've seen other guys, running backs have short careers in the NFL. We've seen other guys put track careers on hold and then come back to them after their football careers. Olympic sprinters, the top guys are 26, 27, 25, 28 years old. Achane could bulk up for an NFL career, play 5 years in the league, retire, slim back down, and go try out for the Olympics. Like, I just think that there's more here than just this was a small running back, and he's always going to be a small running back. He'll always be small, but I think there's some kind of contextual factors that are relevant to maybe he adds more weight than a guy who has been focusing on playing running back the whole time anyway, where Achane has kind of had his attention split between football and another sport.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. I mean, even if it's another 5 or 10 pounds, I don't think he's going to be I don't know if 20 pounds is really realistic for him, but at the same time,
get him to 195.
Yeah.
That's a little more palatable.
Yeah, and I mean, let's remember, Clinton Portis had a strong season at 195 for the Denver Broncos as a rookie. Now, he worked his way all the way up to about 220 at one point when he was with Washington. But, again, I think 10 to 15 pounds is reasonable, and we're talking even 203. And even if they use him as a lead back, but with a kind of in the DeAndre Swift Spiller kind of way, where they're going to get a fair enough touches to be a fantasy factor, a strong fantasy factor. They just may decide that they want a bigger back in a certain role, but the consistency of touches is going to be there. So what about Tyjae Spears? Where I saw you tweet something about maybe we're all just kidding ourselves. I think I'm paraphrasing. Maybe we're all kidding ourselves, and what we need to understand is that Tyjae Spears is Clyde Edwards-Helaire. But is that Clyde Edwards-Helaire the way people thought Clyde Edwards-Helaire was going to be? You know, if you're looking at like the ESPNs of the world who were thinking they were getting Marshall Faulk, or is it the Clyde Edwards-Helaire that a lot of people were disappointed to see? Is the always banged up, you know, open field bully in terms of power, but can't really move a pile, doesn't have much speed. His burst is okay, and then he's not getting opportunities to catch the ball the way that you would think he would.
Yeah, I think probably somewhere in the middle. I don't think. I mean, I think Edwards-Helaire was overdrafted, but I also think he's probably now a little overhated. His career hasn't gone the way that anybody would have hoped, but I think the truth of his ability probably lies somewhere in the middle of that. And I think that's also true of Tyjae Spears. I've also kind of rolled Michael Carter around in my head as a point of comparison. Dion Lewis. You know, I don't think Austin Eckler is a terrible one. I've seen Aaron Jones. If Tyjae Spears could add 5 to 10 pounds, maybe he could be an Aaron Jones type guy. But I've done quite a bit of work on him, or dedicated quite a bit of thought on him, just recently, and I think. A week ago, I would have had no idea what to think about Tyjae Spears. I think now he's an interesting case study for me, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts because I think he's so good out in space, so good out in the open field. He's elusive. He does a great job in a very Alvin Kamara-like way of kind of absorbing contact and flopping away from it, and of kind of dipping his shoulder and making these little weird swings of his hips and his legs to sort of minimize the contact that he's absorbing on a given play, because he's not a super big guy, he's not a super powerful guy, but I do think he has these different ways of creating contact balance for himself kind of out of thin air. He's a very coordinated athlete. He made a really impressive like spinning catch on just kind of a simple throw to the flat against, I don't remember who it was, but right there on the sideline with a guy like hanging on him, and he like dipped his shoulder, spun away, and like tiptoed to gain like 3 extra yards on the sideline. And that's not athleticism that's going to be captured in testing, but he just feels like a very coordinated and well-balanced athlete to me, especially out in space. I have some questions about his ability behind the line of scrimmage. Maybe it's a vision issue. This is the area of my analysis where I'm least confident. I'm fairly self-taught, watching your YouTube videos and watching, schematic breakdowns of running back play and offensive line responsibilities and things like that. So I'm self-taught from like a evaluating running back decision-making standpoint. So I'm interested in your thoughts, but I was not as impressed by his vision, his discipline behind the line of scrimmage, his ability to manipulate defenders, but so good out in space. And so he presents a dichotomy for me where I don't know yet how I should weigh the value of, kind of instinctive ability to make people miss out in space and break tackles. If we were playing tag, Tyjae Spears would be awesome. He'd be one of the best tag players in this class, but running back is only tag once you've already gotten to the open field, and before that it's not a game of tag. And I don't know yet how to kind of weigh the value of a guy who would be great at tag versus a guy who I view as maybe a substandard decision maker behind the line of scrimmage. So I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on just kind of that dichotomy and that concept, as well as, do you agree about my assessment of Tyjae Spears' kind of cerebral ability, or did he look a little bit more favorable to you there?
Yeah, I'll put it to you this way. I mean, I can see the Kamara comparison, but the guy that when I think of in terms of that refined ability to do those things at the size that he's at, that guy is Jamal Charles. And I haven't really compared anybody to Jamal Charles. It's been a while since I've done that. And the one that I did do was kind of faulty he was far. I mean, he was far. I didn't compare him directly, but he was kind of further away. And that was Justin Jackson, had a lot of some of those qualities to his game. But Tyjae Spears, in terms of in terms of vision with Spears, I really liked what I saw in 2021. I thought he could be quicker with avoiding potential penetration. I thought that he could be a little bit late with when he needed to bounce plays. But I thought he's done a good job of being with wide zone, selling the potential for the cutback. Obviously in the open field, I thought he was one of the best two open field runners in this class, regardless of position. I think like him and Tank Dell, the wide receiver for Houston.
That guy was one of I did some wide receiver evaluations for a rookie draft guide that I was contributing to, and Tank Dell, he just pops off the screen. It was like Michael Vick, Dante Hall, Tavon Austin in college. Level of competition caveats apply, but I haven't seen many guys look as quick compared to the competition they're playing as Tank Dell. He was something else.
The only thing that he does that he needs to get better at is that he can lean too hard on juke moves or stop-start moves that slow him down, where he should just be thinking about getting the most yards he can rather than like trying to go for that low percentage big play that can cost him yards on the ground that he could get. But like duo, counter, inside zone, wide zone power, I thought he did a good job of being able to press blocks or press the correct shoulder of the puller, set up the development of the blocks. So I liked that. I thought he cut back opportunities early in zone runs and was efficient with it. Wind back, he was also good at setting up. So I think there's the peripheral vision's good. There may be plays that you saw and I'm sure that I've seen them as well, where maybe he could have pressed a little bit tighter, maybe he missed something, but overall what I saw on his game was very strong. So I'm a believer that Spears is barring the fact that he's had 2 ACL tears, is that Frank Gore had 2 ACL tears and had a career that a lot of fantasy GMs wish ended like 7 years earlier. But at least if you listen to those folks. But I loved Frank Gore. But Jamal Charles is a huge name to put out there. But I think he's a tier below that, and I think that's a pretty awesome tier to be in, and that makes him a top 5 back in my class, on my board. And I believe that he's one of those backs that has a spatial awareness to win in certain ways that are very daring. And just like Charles, they're going to need maybe a year to like really figure out what they can get away with in the NFL and what they can't. And once he does, that's when you're going to see the most efficient version of him and know where that creativity works best for him. Because Charles was that way. Charles I've always described as the kid who was failing algebra because he was at home late at night doing physics experiments. And he was always trying to bounce plays that he shouldn't, or trying to bounce against 3 gaps that you're like, why are you doing that? Like, just take what's there. But he would try and do that crazy stuff. And then in Kansas City, it took him about a year. And because he was bouncing a lot of things outside and trying for cutbacks that were just wild plays. And he got that worked out of him and figured out there's certain situations where I can do that, but not nearly as many. And I think Spears, look at it this way. The USC game, which I didn't think was his best game, but it certainly was a highlight-worthy game.
Most productive one, yeah.
Yeah. When you look at him where he makes a cut against the middle linebacker where he gives a leg and takes away in the middle of the crease, nobody does that as a decision maker at the NFL level unless you're like Barry Sanders or Jamal Charles or LaShawn McCoy, an elite back. But to have the balls to do that against a Pac-10 team like that and get away with it. That tells you a lot about the confidence he has in his movement skills and how good his movement skills are. And I think that he'll learn. He's the type of back that will learn, like, okay, this works, this doesn't. So I'm very high on Tyjae Spears as a player. And like, if you ask me, while it would be a surprise, it wouldn't be that shocking if Tyjae Spears and Zach Evans were the best two backs career-wise if they stay healthy and Robinson and Gibbs don't, or have run into some issues. Like, I think they're not so far away from those two guys in terms of like grades.
Okay. Yeah, I think I just had a thought. What was it? About Spears, and you talked about making these kind of speculative or aspirational moves that just most people wouldn't attempt, and I think kind of what I saw on film maybe jives with that, where my kind of the lowest graded area I had for him, I think, was in discipline, which is kind of where I define as adhering to structure and not kind of bailing for kind of early opportunities or more speculative opportunities. And if he's a dominant player out in the open field, especially against that level of competition, he probably has a little bit more confidence to try things that he wouldn't or shouldn't maybe in a different context. And so you can kind of paint yourself a picture of how a guy who doesn't actually have deficiencies in this area might exhibit them given his other strengths, and then have some growing pains as he kind of acclimates to a higher level of competition in the NFL, but eventually figures it out and has the physical tools to be really effective. So yeah, I even though we came away with kind of different conclusions from his film, I don't think that our conclusions are necessarily mutually exclusive or in kind of
we're coming at it. We're heading in the same direction from different points.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They're not in opposition to each other. I can make sense of what you're seeing in context of what I'm seeing, and I think that
and that's
I think that's good.
I think so too. And it's funny because like from my perspective, it's kind of like you think of like quarterbacks who try to force the ball into tight spots because they have a big arm and they were able to do it in college, and they have the athletic ability to do it on the move. So your Patrick Mahomes, your Caleb Williams, your Matthew Stafford, your any of these types of players. You eventually learn, if you're going to get into the league, when you can try and do that or when you have to try it and when you shouldn't try it at all. And a lot of guys who do succeed figure that out. And I think it was the same with running back when I mentioned Spears in the same level of McCoy and Charles. I know that was an amazing draft class for running backs. Because that was Forte, it was McFadden, Stewart, D'Angelo Williams, was that? No, that wasn't that class. But
I think Williams was 06.
Yeah, that was 06. But Stewart was definitely part of that class. It was one of the best classes I've ever graded. And I think I had Charles like 9th and maybe McCoy 7th because like you with Spears, I was approaching it from the standpoint of, well, I don't know if they're going to fix this. These are wild things that they're doing. They're good backs. They're talented. They're going to have a role. But how good are they going to be? Because they have some decision-making flaws with what they do. And it's like, now it's kind of like, and also theirs were a little more rampant than what I saw from Spears. But at the same time, it could very well be the case that I'm looking at Spears and I'm seeing Charles and McCoy from my perspective of how I looked at things, and when I project, you're projecting based on what you've learned or what you've seen, and based on what you've seen in the NFL. So I could very well be over projecting and saying, I'm too optimistic, with where this is going to go based on looking at two of the most elite players of their generation of that type of style of play. You know, and maybe I'm being too optimistic with that. So it's a fun discussion point for sure.
Yeah, I've kind of wrestled with the same thing with Achane, I think, where, in my mind, if we haven't seen the last, severely undersized running back who's just a stud on all three downs, like, Chris Johnson or Jamal Charles, if we haven't seen the last of that archetype, Achane looks like the best candidate to be that guy of, really anybody we've seen since. Maybe, throw Gibbs in there. And so that's kind of like my high end aspirational comp. But then you have to weigh, how likely is that? That's the ceiling, but, what's kind of like the median outcome? What if, the issues manifest themselves more readily in the NFL? What if the issues don't get fixed? There's just a lot of moving parts where even a player that has a great ceiling, maybe shouldn't be ranked there, or, it's such a case by case basis, and it's difficult to know what to do in each case, because there's so many confounding factors and contextual and environmental things that can contribute. Maybe these guys end up with a running back coach that helps them unlock these skills. Maybe one of them doesn't, and the roll of the dice has a lot to do with this.
Absolutely. Well, one thing that I can tell you is in the roll of the dice, which was the opportunity to have this conversation with you. You can find Noah Hill's work at noahmoreparties.com, also at noahmoreparties on Twitter. And this was a fantastic show. I had a good time talking with you. We could have done a lot more players, but we'd probably be here until nightfall. And unfortunately, that's just not going to work for today. But no, it was an absolute pleasure. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. This is a lot of fun. I'm sure we'll, connect in the future. I love, seeing your work, learning from your work. So I have a lot of respect for you, a lot of appreciation for, the level of detail and thoroughness you have in your process. So thanks for having me on. This is a lot of fun.
Well, it was an honor, and I appreciate the kind words, and I've certainly been enjoying your work. It's a mutual admiration society, and keep it up. And for everybody out there, again, noahmoreparties.com, mattwaldman.com if you want to check out the RSP. It's available. You could pre-draft, post-draft, $21.95. You can read all about it there. Most of y'all who listen have already purchased, and I really appreciate that. And I hope that you're enjoying it. And if you want, give me some feedback on this show. Maybe we can get Noah back on and we can talk about some other backs. Y'all take care.